today with vignettes. A lot of the vignettes you've been working on in the background, we're going to assign a few more today that'll be due next week. But we're going to spend some time together working out a few novel ones in small groups. So, Brittany, there will be a couple points, I think 3 points tonight where we'll need a breakout in the small groups. So just as a heads up, be like 10 and 10 each one. But basically that's what we're going to work on today is kind of do some work together and on those vignettes and work through them after we go through a little bit of an intro to research methods. So before we do that, though, I wanted to, in the spirit of transitioning from the logic and the argumentation into research methods, to kind of close the book on that piece. Get your thoughts. I read through some of the discussions that you all put in, particularly around a lot of it was around the difference between exploratory research and empirical research. A lot of you called out the difference between deductive and inductive. You've been really demonstrating that your thinking has evolved. So I just kind of want to open up to the group to get some closing thoughts from those sections from you all, and maybe some summary statements about what you've learned, what you found surprising, what you found most interesting when it comes to logic and its relation to research methods and what we're doing in this course. So I'll just open it up to the group. Feel free to chime in with anything there, but we'd love to hear your perspectives on that.
Tyler, we can't hear you.
Oh yeah, Tyler. Still can't hear you, Tyler. No, we see you talking. Okay. Let's see, maybe something on our side. Okay. Anyone else? Any thoughts? Any reflections on?
Well, oh,
No, go ahead, Becca. You spoke before.
thanks, Stuart.
Wow, that's crazy.
Oh, now we can hear you, Tyler.
Oh, you can? Okay, cool.
Yeah, we got you now.
Do you
Sorry,
want to go with your thoughts? Go ahead.
Oh, no. Someone else can go first.
All right, I'll just do it. Okay, so logic, I feel like it was a really cool section to learn about because I think the last time I learned about logic was my first algebra class when we had to do proofs and whatnot. So it was cool to kind of see that come back, especially after having lived so much life. And then I had a random thought because it really applies when you think back to it. But I had a random thought in the shower the other day when I was thinking about logical fallacies. And I was like, oh my gosh, that probably relates to what we're learning with argumentation and probably like why, what fallacies are, why logical premises don't make sense. And that connected for me. And I was like, that's crazy. So I don't know. I just thought it was really cool to bring that back in to where we're at now. And I thought it provided a really great base for argumentation in terms of even presenting a business case. And I found it really applicable to my current situation. And even I sent Chris an email trying to understand how to frame. I was really struggling with creating those premises and reading between the lines. So it was interesting to see that, but it lays a really good foundation for like a business case because you're interpreting the information you're getting and then you're laying it out in a format that allows you to create something testable out of it.
Yes.
And that's so real. It's so real because none of the problems you face in real life are just super succinct and really easy to digest. They're like just thrown at you and it's like a kite with its string all tangled up. Like you can't fly it until you untangle the string. And it's like, I know there's only 2 strings, but it feels like there's a million. So I just had a lot of epiphanies during that section. So yeah,
great connection to kind of piecing it together and bringing that new learning in with things you've learned before and illuminating new learnings with what you learned before. That resonates a lot with me, Becca. Yeah, great reflection. Tyler, I know you had some thoughts.
Okay, I just put a comment, so Stuart, disregard that.
Sorry, Stuart.
I found it kind of crazy how deductive reasoning will bring the 99% correct and is the slower process, but most of the time you're going to
Mm.
use inductive reasoning to kind of figure out, kind of test it out. And it's the more scientific way to where it makes sense why businesses would go with that. But then it makes sense also why there's gaps in a business, because if it works, it works, it works. You're never asking the question of why does it work? How does it work? And now shoring up your business to where you can almost become successful overnight and then not have the process and processes to sustain that success.
Mm.
So we talked
Yeah,
a little
that's
bit
a
about
great application. Yeah.
how you're gonna be deductive as you can within an inductive world, right? And that's kind of what you're scratching out there, Tyler, is, hey, we have this process and it works, but hey, this one little piece doesn't work that really well. So could we maybe do something deductive in this place? And when we get to more about research methods and Dr. Ben starts talking about, well, we're going to isolate one variable or we're going to create a unique condition, we're taking a deductive approach for a very small part of the universe. And now you might take something that's overall inductive and zoom in and say, well, we're going to test this deductively. And I don't want to steal any thunder from weeks to come, but your point about going back and forth between deductive and inductive tends to be how we attack big problems. Deductive is how you get down to the micro level, and it's where
Mhm.
it's the building blocks of large theories.
That's right. Yeah, great reflection there, Tyler. Stuart.
Well, for me, it was inductive and deductive reasoning. The reason being is because last class we had for talent assessments, we have to create KSAOs for HR manager. And out of the blue, I just decided to put deductive and inductive reasoning. And learning from it this semester and this past week, it's now I understand more than what I had already known as to why that's such an important ability. Being able to have inductive and deductive reasoning, especially as an HR manager, which you're gonna come across, as Tyler said. There's always gonna be a lot of deductibles in inductible reasoning. So trying to figure out which is right, which is wrong, it could break your head. Like for me, the last exam we did, it broke my head as I got to the final ones. But like at first I was getting the hang of it, but it involves a lot of thinking and a lot of like finding the details into each argument that you come across, finding the details that make sense, finding the details that are premises that aren't like conclusive or premises that aren't exactly true, trying to figure all that out. Now like I fully understand as to why it's important in the HR manager role.
Yeah, I guess it sounds like you still are in strong agreement that those would be good KSAOs for an HR manager. Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that's a really good point too, Stuart. Like, I think as Chris and I were coming into this course, and even as we were putting the material together, and you may have heard us talk about this in some of the recordings, that ability to think critically is really what we hope you get out of this entire course. At the end, if you all feel like you are much better able to break down business statements, to be more critical of those, to challenge premises that are being brought up in an organization, that will dramatically improve your likelihood of being successful in your career as an HR professional, as an organizational psychologist. In my assessment, having worked with, I went to school with folks like yourselves and myself who were going through this training. I've seen people get IO degrees and come into the workforce. I've seen IOs compared to MBAs, and no disrespect to MBAs, but the biggest difference that an IO psychologist brings, in my opinion, is the ability to think like a scientist. That does not get old. The technology is not going to take that away from you in terms of being important. It is a absolutely critical skill set that's going to make you extremely valuable and very marketable on the job market. So I love that point, Stuart, that it's really got you, it's breaking your brain a little bit. That's good, because if it's doing that now and you get more and more practice with this, it's going to get easier and it's going to get easier and it's going to get easier. You get into the job and you're going to be amazed at how valuable that skill set is.
Hey, Ben, I'd love to add one other additional thing, because I think 80-20 rule, I think 80% of the value we want out of logic is exactly what Dr. Ben just summarized. The other 20% is the skill of generating clarity. And in addition to your ability to think through a problem and understand what argument is being made, once you have an opinion about that, you now are armed with a language that you can go back to the person making the ask of you and say, is this what you meant? Here's what I heard. I broke it down into something logical. Is this what you're saying? This causes this, causes this. And sometimes when they're totally out in left field, they'll be like, no. Why would I'm like, all right, well, now I know that that's not what you think. But now I'm calling it out, right? The Socratic method a little bit. But it's a huge skill in any corporate walk is the ability to take in something someone's saying, decipher it, state it back in a logical way, because then at least you're on the same page. Even if that page is a little crazy or not exactly where you thought you were going to be, it creates clarity. And that's another, in addition to the creative ability to move from argument to premises to conclusions, the clarity is a really huge weapon for you also to wield, because it will help you not run off in the wrong direction and do a ton of work and then come back and realize you answered a question nobody asked.
So I'm bragging about you in the chat, Chris. Becca.
Yeah, I was just wondering because you're mentioning how, like, yeah, it is a really great skill, but realistically, how often is this applied? Because you can sit in conversations with like a strategy team and you hear in 5 minutes like 10 crazy things from 4 different people. And it's like, I don't have the time to sit there and create a logic flow argument to understand and dissect
Good
what each
point.
one of them are saying. So it's kind of like, when would
Good
you
point.
apply that, and how do you get to a place where you're like, that's the one I'm going to deconstruct and go down?
Yeah, that's a good point, Becca. And I'll give my answer. And Chris, I'd love you to layer in because I know you have some thoughts here. But my answer to that would be we're going through what I would call a very formal process of breaking it down for your ability, my ability, and Chris's ability to really digest it and break the process apart for something that in the future is going to be automatic for you. But it can't be automatic unless you learn about it and you go through it and you practice it and you break it down into its component parts and you understand this piece and that piece and that piece. And a personal anecdote, when I was going through the version of this class, when I was going through my schooling, my education, I remember my advisor said, highly recommend you go take a logic course. And I was like, why? That I had no idea. I understands like Dr. MacGyver's why? What does that have to do with statistics? And she was like, just take it. And so I took it. And I didn't realize the connection till years after I got my PhD. I didn't understand the connection. And so even as we were prepping for this course, Chris and I were pulling this material together and we were reflecting on, man, I hadn't thought about this, syllogisms and deductive logic and inductive logic. But what we realized was we do this stuff every day. Like you said, Becca, we do it every day, but we're not taking spreadsheets and breaking down arguments. We're just doing it reflexively. But it's because we had the experience that you're having now of going through step by step by step. And then fast forward a few years, this stuff's going to be, you're going to be doing it like this automatically. It's going to become reflexive. Chris, curious your thoughts.
Yeah, the analogy I would use is when we did our intros on week 1, we had a lot of athletes in the room. I think we had some softball players, some football players, some track. Anybody spend time in the weight room as part of being on a team? Yeah, yeah. In any of the sports that you ever played, have you ever had to bench press your opponent? No, never had to bench. Okay, cool. Then why do you do bench presses? Because it makes you stronger, right? It's not because there's a direct correlation between the literal exercise and the thing you're going to do. This is weightlifting for your brain, right? So think about it that way, right? The formality that we're going through in the exercise is the same way that you keep your strong form when you're doing your bench. You're keeping your back straight when you're doing your squats, right? Because it builds muscles that you're going to use later, right? And not in a direct way, But that's essentially the analogy, Becca, about this. You're not going to go to Ben's point and create these exercises and run through them. But the skills that you're creating here are kind of like learning a language, and you'll get more and more fluent with it, right? And oftentimes, exactly what you said happens. 15 things come at you, and you just take some good notes. And the magic term or the magic phrase that I tend to use is, these are really interesting thoughts. Let me dig into them, right? And you don't have to react in the moment. You can say, I need a minute basically to consolidate what we said, and then come back and say, here's what I think I heard, right? Now, there may be one or two you need to attack in the moment, and as you get better and better, you can do it faster and faster. But weightlifting for your brain, that's my answer.
I love that, Chris. That was a better answer. Oh yeah, let's see. Brains. Yeah, yeah. Brett, that's right on. And you can sometimes even potentially move that process to the subconscious when it gets, or you do it so much that the myelin, you ever heard of that? The myelin, where in your brain, where you do something over and over and over and over and over and over again, and then your brain creates the shortcut, which sometimes can reduce your creativity, but it makes it automatic. And so that's that weightlifting for your brain. So yeah, that was great reflections. Thanks for your thoughts, everybody. That was really good. And so with that, let's take that weightlifting analogy, and now we're going to take it into the field, and we're going to start actually, let's apply some of that to actually organizational research and methods that you're going to be engaging in really the heart of this course. So I'm going to jump into some slides, and just give me 1 second. All right. Okay. All right. So basically, this is a very, very simplistic view of the scientific method. And we talked a little bit about it in theory. We haven't really broken it down. But if you remember, if any of you out of a show of hands, anybody did science fair when they were in school, in grade school? Yeah, I did too. I don't know about y'all. Did y'all like it? I hated it. Some people did. I couldn't stand doing it at the time, and now I'm like super glad I did it. But it's kind of goes back to the old science fair, right? Where basically when we're doing in research methods is where first we're probably making some observations about something. Hey, people are showing up late to work. Hey, we're losing people at a high rate, high turnover. And then we're going through some process. A lot of what we already talked about, and then we're formulating a hypothesis, which is essentially a prediction about what we think is going to happen. At that point, we then create data, like we talked about, or we're capturing data. We're making some sort of observation. We might do it through a survey. We might do it through just sitting in a room and observing. We might do it through collecting what we sometimes call digital exhaust, which is just data that's basically output of digital transactions. And we're getting more and more and more of that. Chris talked a lot about that, about the massive amounts of data that we have. So we're collecting data. Then we analyze that data. And that's where we're going to be talking a lot about in week 4 and 5, how to analyze that data. And then from there, we're drawing conclusions or inferences, right? So what did we learn about the data? Did we support our hypothesis? Did we have the data that we observed? Did it support our hypothesis? Did it negate our hypothesis? Is it telling us something altogether different? We're drawing that conclusion or that prescription, and what do we do about it? And then the part that sometimes gets missed, and the part that we were very intentional about adding to this course, is F, communicating the findings. And in my opinion, this is a place where a lot of IO psychologists, a lot of researchers are trained extremely well on A through E. And then we get to point F and we fall flat on our face. And in an organizational setting, your ability to communicate those findings in a compelling way is absolutely critical. If you conduct a tremendous experiment or you run an amazing research study in your organization and you stink at communicating it, it's like a tree falling in the woods. It's almost as if if nobody saw it, did it happen in the minds of the people you're trying to influence? No. And if you believe that perception is reality, which I do, then people are going to act or not act on it. And so your ability to communicate effectively about what you did, what your assumptions were, what your premises were, how you collected the data, defining those variables that determine how you collected the data, and making and wrapping that all in the business case or the business problem and translating that in a way that's going to be meaningful to your stakeholders. That's a lot. That's a lot for a researcher and an organizational psychologist to be good at. And for better or worse, that's what we're trying. That's what good IOs do, is they're good at all of those things. And we're going to try to train you to be good at each of them, including point F and communicating your findings. So before I leave this part, I don't know, Chris, any thoughts before we kind of move on to some other parts, but I don't want to speed too much through the scientific method.
I'll keep it brief, but I think the big difference in F between from A to E is that A to E are very based in logic, right? And scientists are trained in logic. But humans are not wired for logic, right? It's an acquired skill, right? We are trained for emotion, we're trained for affiliation, or we're wired for affiliation, we're wired for emotion, we're wired to make assumptions. And so how we take in and stay engaged in communication is a whole heck of a lot less about logic and a whole heck of a lot more about, the science of attention. And so a lot of the things that we'll talk about in the space of communication is about how you make that transition from, okay, I've been very logical up to this point to build the thing that I can stand behind, but now I got to go out there and sell it. And selling something is very different. And Dr. Ben is one of the best I've ever seen at this, both when we were on the same team and when we've been on different teams. And it's a really good skill to have. And so, yeah, it's just to Ben's point, if no one buys it, doesn't matter how good the product is.
Yep. Chris made a really interesting point and a critical point about how human beings are not naturally well wired for things like logic and probability. And you probably saw the video, or you will see a video coming up around why that might be the case. But one of the things that it really is important to know as a psychologist, not just an organizational psychologist, but as you become a psychologist, is to understand how people process information. And from an evolutionary standpoint, human beings have always been social. Right? In fact, historically, how we have evolved have been by people who have lived in very, very social environments. They made just about all their decisions in social environments. And humans are emotional. And we're emotional in a way. Emotions are an evolutionary reflex to something that once our ancestors didn't, they didn't know. A snake, a spider. At one point in our human evolution, it was unknown that snakes were dangerous. Seeing a snake probably generated no fear whatsoever. And our curiosity got the best of us. And then over time, some people got bit, some people didn't. The ones who got bit didn't reproduce. And the ones who did and developed a concern or a care or an emotional reaction for that survived. And they passed those genes on generation and generation and generation and generation. And then here we are. And so the emotions that we experience, that is not, when people say take your emotion out of it, that's nonsense. Emotion is part of cognition. It's not separate. It's part of cognition. And human beings process information emotionally. And that's important to remember. And that's why this part F, and we're going to focus on that in the final 2 weeks, of what are the things you can do, the tips, the tricks, the how you communicate this that can make a decent research study appear brilliant, or can make a brilliant research study a dud because you can't effectively communicate. So really important piece, that part F. We also talked about starting with background theories, right? I won't bring all the inductive and the deductive back, but you recall that when we're doing inductive research, which almost all of the research that we're going to do is largely inductive, and then as Chris pointed out, we're going to do it parts of it as deductively as possible. But you remember with inductive research and inductive logic, we have to have a background theory. And you're going to hear this in IO psychology a lot, whether you go to PSYOP eventually. Out of curiosity, has anybody ever been to the PSYOP conference yet? By show of hands? Okay, not yet, but you will eventually. And that's essentially the Society for Industrial Organizational Psychology to do an annual conference every April. Eventually you'll go. But that's one of the things you're going to hear a lot is that it's um, really focused on what is the background theory for the research you're doing. And if you're doing academic research, it's essential that you're coming in with good, strong background. And that's why if you read academic articles as part of your program, you're going to notice that lengthy intro, all the background research that researcher did to tee up what the hypothesis is. And so this is a really critical piece of not only the academic side, but as you apply this research and as you stand up to the rigor of biopsychology and the research methods that are part of biopsychology, of really making sure that you have a good, well-established theory as you're forming a hypothesis. It's a really important piece when that's possible to do in an organization. Becca.
I'm a little confused as to where that theory comes from. If you have to start with a background theory, like where would you get that?
Yeah, maybe I'll share it a good example here. So I think we asked this the other day last week. You remember the trend, the quiet quitting trend that was very popular in the popular press? There's a lot of talk about quiet quitting, and quiet quitting essentially was a phrase that was coined in the popular press where people were staying in their jobs but doing the bare minimum. They were only doing what was required, and then they were basically doing nothing above and beyond. Okay, so that was a clever term that was come up by a reporter. I actually happened to meet that reporter a couple of weeks ago. Very interesting. She had absolutely no background theory as to why she called it quiet quitting. However, as we brought that into the IO psychology forums, a lot of people started picking it apart. Oh, that's BS. That's nothing to see here. But then there was an alternative approach, which was, okay, so maybe quiet quitting isn't the right term. Maybe that idea of doing the bare minimum, is that really a thing? What we did have background theories and research on are two related concepts. One is organizational citizenship behavior. Are y'all familiar with that term? OCBs, citizenship behavior. Another way to put it, contextual performance. These are behaviors that people engage in above and beyond their job requirements. So that is extremely well researched in the literature. There's a lot of research about what predicts people's likelihood to engage in those extra role behaviors or those contextual performance or OCBs, whatever you call them. And there's a lot of research already that's established as to what inhibits people from doing it. And so with quiet quitting is basically the flip side of that. It's people, what causes people not to engage in OCBs or to engage in what we sometimes call CWBs or counterproductive work behaviors. So that's an example of how you could take a concept and say, that's an interesting question, but what we have a lot of research on already is organizational citizenship behavior and what causes people or predicts people's ability to engage and go above and beyond in their job, and also what predicts people engaging in counterproductive behaviors, sabotage, not helping a friend, intentionally ignoring a customer because they're annoyed or because they're disengaged. So that is an example of how you might take a background theory research that's already been done, and then you can build on top of that. So to answer your question more in the abstract, what generally you do, your awareness of all of these psychological theories, human motivation, what predicts employee engagement, what predicts turnover, what are the different models of modeling how people turn over and leave an organization. Your basic understanding of those is going to provide a theoretical foundation for a lot of the questions that you're going to go answer in an organizational setting. And that's why you're getting well-rounded education in psychology, but also all these different subfields of IO. Chris.
Yeah, if to walk it back, and that was a great answer, Ben. Essentially, IO is a subdivision of social psychology, and social psychology is a subdivision of psychology, right? So what you're doing is social psychology at work. When you go out and you work in HR or you work in a business setting, 8 out of 10 people, maybe 9 out of 10 people you run into don't really have any basis in those theories. But there's thousands of hours of research, tens of thousands of hours of research over the last 50 years, both in academic and applied settings. And a huge chunk of what you need to do in your IO degree is learn what those theories are so that you can understand them. And if somebody says everyone is quitting because of XYZ, and we take that logical premise to conclusion, you can say, actually, well, interesting. There's science about compensation. There's science about OCBs. There's science about CWBs. Let's go see what the science says before we start making assumptions about why what's happening. And then maybe we need to go get some data. Maybe we need to go get some research to see if what we're seeing lines up with that science. But what Dr. Ben is saying is you don't just start doing science in a vacuum, right? Because there's a 99% chance the thing that's happening in your organization has happened before and somebody's done a paper about it. And that doesn't mean you never make things up, and it doesn't mean you never have to move really fast. But always going back to theory is one of the things that also separates, I think, IOs from MBAs, is that grounding in actual theory that's been validated over 50 years of work.
Yep. Great ad. And we talk about it in the chat. If you're not familiar with psyop.org, get yourself familiar with it. Put it in your your common, whatever it's called, your bookmarks. Go to it frequently. It's in my bookmarks on both my personal computer, my work computer. It doesn't have an easy repository of all the different theories, but it's a great resource. Yep, here you go. There you go. Great resources to go to reference so that you can get yourself familiar. And the reality is I still learn about new little subfields of psychology regularly. You're never going to know them all because it's always changing, it's always evolving, they're always adding. But your understanding of things like common ones, I'm going to give you a few: employee engagement, employee turnover, employee commitment, job satisfaction, performance and productivity, performance management, selection and assessment, understanding of the human motivation, understanding of those the foundational theories within those areas is going to give you a great group dynamics is another one, a great foundation. And then you'll start to learn the different areas to jump off of and the resources where you can learn a little bit more. Okay. So now let's go into this notion of correlation and causation. We're bringing this up early. We're going to revisit this when we do get into correlation. But I think this is a really important concept to share here. You've all heard correlation does not infer causation, but let's break that down a little bit, right? Correlation really, well, it's really just a measure of association. How related are two variables or two phenomena or two occurrences? When one thing, generally we portray it as a scatter plot where we have two variables. When one goes up, what happens to the other variable, right? If engagement goes up in an organization, if you improve engagement, what happens to performance, for example? And we can generally show, and it's fairly easy to show, that when one thing goes up, another goes down, or when one thing goes down, another one goes down too. When one thing goes up, another thing goes up. So we can establish this relationship. Correlation is generally what we are demonstrating in vast majority of organizational research, that there's an association. It can be positive association, meaning that as the X or as one variable goes up, the other one goes up. It could be a negative correlation, meaning that as one variable goes up, the other goes down. Or it could be zero relationship, meaning that if there really is no systematic relationship between those two variables. But finding that there is a relationship does not mean that engagement caused performance, for example. If we determine, and I'll give you some examples, we do a lot of work at Qualtrics to look at organizational survey results. And very, very commonly, what we'll do is look at outcomes like employee engagement or people's intent to stay, or even we'll even calculate actual turnover data. We'll go back in time, look at old survey results, and we'll take turnover data and say, hey, if we look at that historical results of the survey, can we predict with that data, that past data, who left and who didn't? And so that's a pretty easy and pretty common analysis we'll do. It's purely correlational because what we're doing is showing that if I felt good about my relationship that I had with my manager, then I'm less likely to leave. There's a negative correlation there. Or if I had high engagement and high intent to stay, meaning I plan on sticking around longer, I have lower likelihood to turnover. People who have higher engagement are less likely to turnover. That's correlational, but it absolutely is not causational. We cannot just say that being higher in engagement causes somebody to leave or not to leave. That's almost never a conclusion we can draw. And we're going to break a little bit of the reasons down why.
I want to add here that correlation underpins all forms of machine learning, deep learning, generative AI, and all that fancy stuff you're hearing about out there in the space right now. They're confident correlations. There are hundreds of thousands of correlations. They're triangulated correlations. They predict, but they're not causal. Every single one of them. They are stacked correlations, from Amazon telling you what you think you want to buy next, to Netflix telling you what show you're going to buy, to ChatGPT answering your questions about Henry VIII. It is all correlation. It's really, really strong, amazing engineering with correlations, but it's not causation.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to put that out there because we'll probably get into that a little bit later in the semester.
That's a really good point, Chris. And I'll add on to that. This was a challenge we had, and I'll get to you in a second, Becca. One of the challenges we had, even when I was going through graduate school, is a lot of us we were learning about pretty advanced methods, things like structural equation modeling, which is well beyond the scope of this course, or hierarchical linear modeling, various forms of machine learning that we were doing. We sometimes would run into this problem where, oh, if it's a complicated or a fancy analysis, then it must be causal. We were making that mistake even in graduate school. And like, oh, we're just running a bivariate correlation. Oh, that's just a correlation. But when we run this multiple regression equation, yeah, that's getting us closer to causation. Oh, and we can statistically control for these variables that we have in our model. Oh, we controlled for those things. That is not the same. And that's pretty much what Chris is saying, is that a lot of this very advanced algorithms, or things that appear to be advanced to the layman, people have a tendency to over index on, hey, well, that's more likely to be a causal relationship. And that's just not true. You cannot replace good experimental design with statistical controls. They just do not replace. So you could have, for example, a very poorly constructed experiment run a very fancy analysis, for lack of a better way to put it, and it's no better than looking at a correlation matrix. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind as you start to learn about more advanced techniques. The ability to infer causation is extraordinarily difficult. We're going to talk about it in a second. And in most organizational settings is close to impossible. But we're going to break down what you have to do to be able to get to that point.
You can predict something without understanding its cause, right? And a lot of what you want to do in business often is predict something. And sometimes you care about why the thing is happening, and sometimes you just care that the thing is happening. And so you need to be clear about this as you're doing research and answering questions with your business partners, and asking, well, do you just care that I know who's going to quit? Or do you want to know why they're quitting? Because those are very, very different questions. And being able to predict that someone is going to quit is very different than being able to explain why they're going to quit.
Okay, sorry, I was chatting. Let's get to that point. Before we'll do a little moment of levity here. This is a fact. Um, that every single person who confuses correlation with causation ends up dying. Fact. There you go. Okay, so to your question, Becca, how are these things related? They are intimately related. In other words, in order to determine that something caused another thing, that engagement caused people to perform better or caused people to leave, which really you can never prove that. But for the sake of argument, to get to that point, the first thing you have to do is establish that there is a relationship, that there is a correlation, that these two variables are associated with each other. So that is, correlation is one of the requirements of causation. But you got to go further. What you also have to do is show that the cause happened before the predictor in time, or I'm sorry, the outcome in time. In other words, the time in which you measured your what you thought was going to cause something else was before the actual cause showed up. And when the absence of that predictor or that variable was, you didn't see the cause. And so that's the second criteria, which is also pretty hard to do. But in research and organizational research, these first two are pretty common. We can establish these first two pretty easily and pretty strongly. We can say, that there's a relationship. That's quite easy. We're going to learn about that in week 5. We can also establish temporal precedence, that the cause happened before the effect in time, and that when the cause was absent, the effect was absent. That's fairly easy to do. But the third piece is the piece that is very, very difficult in an organizational setting to establish. And this idea is a number of different ways to put it: non-spuriousness, but also that you're able to, another way to put it is you're able to control for all other possible causes or factors that could have explained the existence of the effect. So again, correlation, the cause happened before the effect. And if before the cause was there, the effect wasn't there. And then third, we can rule out every possible other explanation. In other words, there's no underlying spurious relationship. There's no spurious relationship because something else is causing that to happen. A classic one is I think if I remember correctly, it was the relationship between ice cream sales and murders. That they are very highly correlated, but ice cream sales obviously does not cause murders to happen at a higher rate. What's underlying that is summertime and the spurious relationship that, hey, they're related, but they're not causal. There's something else causing both of those to happen. When it's summertime, people buy more ice cream. When it's summertime, people are out and about more. People might be a little bit ornery because of the heat. People are not locked up in their homes, and therefore you have more violence in public. And so that's a great example. It's a classic example of a correlation that is absolutely has no causal or any related other than the fact that they both happen in summertime because it's hot and because people are outside. So let me pause there for a second. That hopefully explains the relatedness, how they're similar, but also how they're different, and the requirements for causation, which are going to be really important for you to understand.
Hey Ben,
Any
I would love
thoughts? Any
somebody
questions?
to
Yep, go ahead.
explain. It was part of the reading this week. The Dewey-Truman error, because it's a really good example of what Dr. Ben was just talking about.
The way I understood it was the way that they explained it in the reading had to do with choosing a sample population size without thinking about the effect. How do I put this? Basically, like, they chose a sample size with the intention of measuring something specific, but that sample size excluded an entire population of people based on accessibility to that survey. And that entire population of people that was excluded would have had a huge impact on the survey results of what they were looking for. And so because they were excluded, the data that they collected was warped against reality. And so they weren't actually able to get an accurate idea of who would be the top candidate for presidency because they excluded a bunch of people who didn't have access to phones. And it just so happened that the majority of people who had access to phones were Republican leaning, I believe. And so it actually made it seem like there was the Republican candidate was going to win because those were the people who were surveyed. So it left out an entire population of people based off of accessibility and the assumption that they would have access to this, but in reality, they didn't.
Yes, that's exactly right. So at the time, having a phone meant you were wealthy. And to this day, being wealthy tends to correlate with conservatism. And so when they decided they were going to do the research by calling a bunch of people and asking them who they were going to vote for president, a significant amount of them said they were going to vote for the Republican. And so this newspaper famously or infamously declared Dewey the winner, right? But there was this underlying spurious relationship between people who were likely to pick up a phone and people who were going to vote for Republicans, right? And so, and a lot of times in IO psychology, we use what are called convenience samples. But that premise aside right now, the idea here that Dr. Ben was getting at is that the underlying spurious relationship can sometimes cloud what effect you think you're seeing.
And Chelsea, did you mean intentional? Yeah. That's hard to say.
I hope not.
I serious polling organizations, I would say no. But does it happen intentionally? In some cases, I'd be willing to bet it does.
Yeah. I tend to find it tends more to be a combination of speed and ignorance than maliciousness. Businesses are just
I
trying
agree
to
with
move
that.
fast. They're trying to do things, and they're not doing their homework, right? And so they get down a path because, right, some intern was like, why don't we just call people? There's this new thing called the telephone. And nobody thought about the fact that only rich people had telephones. Right? I don't think it was malicious as much as it was a combination of ignorance and speed. But
Mhm.
there are definitely malicious people out there, but they're the great minority in my experience.
The other concept that I think is really important to be aware of that is going to help us talk about cause and effect, and as we go into the research methods, is the difference between an independent variable and a dependent variable. This is going to be language that you're going to hear in psychology. You're probably pretty familiar with this already, but these terms are good to know. We're going to talk about them. We're going to use them in this course to explain essentially what the predictor and the criterion, the cause and the effect, so to speak, in a causal relationship. The independent variable is basically what we would consider the cause. This is the variable that if we can tweak, if we can manipulate, or we can measure and we can look at the variance of it, then we can determine how does that impact some other variable or what we might call the effect. And that is more appropriately called the dependent variable. And the reason it's called the dependent variable is because it's dependent on the independent variable. It's dependent on what happens with the value of the independent variable. So these are terms we're going to use. Now, in IO psychology, one of the things that we were trained is oftentimes because we're not in a lab, we're not actually doing a controlled experiment, like maybe an experimental psychologist would do, where you can actually control for a lot of the third factors that could, create a spurious correlation. We don't have that luxury in an actual organization. There's very few, if any, organizations that are going to allow you to completely control the environment where no other factor can influence somebody's behavior, because that's usually what we're trying to do, is predict people's attitudes and behaviors. We almost never have the ability to control for those other factors. So because of that, we tend to use different terminology. And so instead of using an independent variable that might be more appropriate in a traditional lab setting where we can control everything else except for that one variable, we call that a predictor. And then instead of a dependent variable, again, where we can't control everything, we call that a criterion. And so sometimes you'll hear these used interchangeably. It is important that that a predictor, that's pretty much the same thing as an independent variable. A criterion, pretty much the same thing as a dependent variable. And we tend to use predictor and criterion in IO psychology because we're not really able to control things in a laboratory setting. So I don't know there are some other terms that are used in different subfields that you might run across. I don't know if you have any thoughts there, Chris, you wanted to share. There's a little note here, but
Yeah, I'll throw in the data angle on this, right? So when we're talking about what we're manipulating and what we're measuring, right? We talk about the IV and the DV. In the world of data, they don't really think like that as much. They think about cross tabulations often, like the pivot tables we did in the data manipulation exercise. And in that case, you tend to have two kinds of things, what are called dimensions and things that are called measures. Dimensions are things you would split a group up by. So what region do you work in? What job code do you hold? What generation are you a part of? Where do you sit? And then there are things that we can measure about you. What's your tenure? How much money did you make? How much did you sell last week? The things that we would put inside the pivot table as opposed to the thing that would be the rows and the columns of the pivot table. Those correlate highly with what is an IV and what is a DV. If we then want to say, do people in the Southwest sell more than people in the West? Now our dimensions are our IVs and our measures are our DVs, but they're not necessarily the same thing. So when we're talking about science, we tend to talk about IVs and DVs. When we're talking about data manipulation, we tend to talk about dimensions and measures, and they're intimately related, but they're fundamentally different things and have different definitions.
yeah. And this is mostly, it's not, this is not something we're going to test you on, knowing the difference between these, predictor and criterion use when here and dimensions and measures used in this setting. It's more to make you aware that you're going to see these terms come up. You're going to see dimensions and measures in certain areas in an organization. You might be working with people that think and talk in that way. You might run into a data scientist or experimental psychologist in your work, and they might use IVs and DVs. And then you might be working with IOs that talk about predictors and criterions. The point is, you need to know that these things are used, these terms are used, and approximately what they're talking about. It's going to help you translate that information. So when you hear predictor and criterion, IVDV. You hear dimension measures, you can think, shortcut, IVDV, or predictor criterion. So being aware that you're going to hear these different terms, but they're basically talking about the same things when it comes to research methods, that's the point. That's what we're trying to get across here. So let's do this. We're going to take a bit of a small group exercise if we could. And I'd like you in your small groups to reflect on 3 really basic questions that we talked a little bit about. And take 10 minutes in your small groups in your pairs. And then we'll come back and we'll have each of you share some thoughts from the group. But basically, the first one that we didn't talk about yet, but I want to kind of understand what you're thinking around this is why is random assignment and random selection so important in research? The example, the Dewey-Truman example is that's a good example there that you can use. But why is that so important? Why is it so important that it's random? What about randomness is so important in this research? Second, can we ever conduct a true controlled experiment in an organizational setting? I kind of tipped you off as to my thoughts, but challenge me on it. If you can think of a scenario where you can, challenge me on it. And then can we ever be confident in the cause effect conclusion in organizational research? Take a stab at it in your small group, and then we'd love your thoughts when you come back. So with that, I don't know, Brittany, can
Yep,
get all set up?
absolutely. Oh,
All right. Okay, welcome back. So do we have any volunteers to get us started? We'll just spend about 10 minutes kind of getting your reflections on it. Any takers?
We can go. Our group.
Stuart's jumping at the bit.
Go ahead, Stuart.
Okay, go ahead, Chelsea.
I was just gonna say, Becca, go share what
That's
we
what I was
learned.
waiting for.
Yeah.
Take the lead.
hey,
take the lead for us.
I want to hear. Becca takes the lead all the time. Stop copping out. Come on. Leaders go first.
No,
Leaders.
no, it's
But they
because
eat last.
We
no,
have a
it's
Yeah,
because
they
we
do.
we
Becca
all
was
shared in a
was
group of
the
six.
documentary
No,
or no? Go ahead, Stuart.
it's because no, we all shared in a group of six, but Becca was the one doing the note taking, so that's why she's the one to share for our group.
All right. I'll give you a break this time.
I'll go. I don't mind. I'll go. It's not a problem.
I know, yeah.
Because she
Hey,
has
we
the
can
more accurate
speak, Brit.
information.
We're no one's afraid to. No one's afraid.
Yeah, no one's afraid, Britt. No one's afraid.
All right, I'm on the edge of my seat. What we got?
You know what? I'll share the first one that we came up with. Why is random assignment selection so important? And then Beck, if she wants to take over for the next one, and then Tyler the next one, we could do that. So for why is random assignment selection so important? In our group, we said that it eliminates biasness. So let's say, for instance, you have 15 students. They all know each other. The smart ones want to be with the smart ones. This eliminates that opportunity for them to group up and leave the other ones out of the picture. Although at the same time, it could randomly select all five of them together, but this eliminates that opportunity for them to select one another. Of course, you always have the option of selecting each group, like putting individual people into each group. But with randomized, it eliminates the biasness. It doesn't allow for the professor to, choose who he wants. It's more of like, let's have a random group and let's see what comes up with this random group. In this case, we could put a smart person with someone that's not really knowledgeable, and it'll help both of them learn from each other. And this, like for instance, let's say I'm smart, and Ben, sorry, I'm gonna throw you in here, and you're not that smart.
Fair enough.
If we're in a group of two and we come up with a project, it's gonna show who's doing the work. Because when the time comes to present, if you're not really doing nothing, you're going to be clueless as to what's going on in the final presentation compared to me that I know what's going on. So in this case, it motivates both people, the smart and unsmart, in my case, you and me. It motivates for the both of us to actually want to learn from one another. I might learn more from you, you might learn more from me. And at the end of the day, we're both learning from each other and we're both getting the context as to what we're doing.
So going, I appreciate that, Stuart. So I think one of the main points you're talking about is the importance of random is that we're more likely to spread out the characteristics, get a good mix or spread of the characteristics of things that might impact the DV or the dependent
Correct.
variable, right?
Correct.
And in your example, you pointed out we didn't talk about sample size yet. We'll talk about that next week. But you also pointed out a really good thing is that in your example, we have like 15 people, right? And we randomly assign that can help. But as you correctly pointed out, even randomly, there's a decent chance, like if let's say there was 5 super smart people, 5 moderately smart people, and 5 not so smart people in that 15 group, and you randomly assigned and you randomly selected 5, there's actually a chance you could pick 5 all smart people. That's possible. That's the probability that is possible. And that's where sample size comes in, right? When you apply that random assignment to a much larger group, say 1,500 people or 15,000 or 150,000 or 15 million, then the likelihood dramatically increases that you're going to get a good mix or spread of the characteristics that could potentially impact the cause. So I think that's a really good example.
Bonus points for anybody from the reading in chapter 5 that defines what Dr. Ben was just talking about. It was a very
Shuffle
particular
problem.
That's exactly right, Chelsea. What's the shuffle problem?
Nice.
The shuffle problem it was pertaining to music and how that even with the shuffling, they were still like people were still getting like 6 songs and like the same 6 songs in a row.
Right.
A long, long time ago, maybe some of you were old enough for this, but a lot of you weren't. We would have a CD or we would have the first iPods and we would shuffle, right? It was a cool feature where you didn't know what song was coming next. And the software engineers created a truly random algorithm to be random. But truly random might mean you listen to the same Taylor Swift song 7 times in a row, because that's technically possible. And when you have hundreds of millions of consumers listening to billions of songs, that's going to happen. And they started receiving complaints about the fact that this shuffle is broken. And the engineers really had to literally make the randomness less random so that people thought it was random. Because random really means anything is possible. And that, to Ben's point, is why sample size is so important.
So really quickly on the randomness, let's stick on that for a second. What is the random assignment? So the randomness itself of this random selection or the random assignment, right? We know that's important because it kind of it 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 helps to make sure that we're not biased in the sampling, for example, if we're doing sampling. But what is the randomness really doing to the sample? What do you know what that phrase is? Or maybe you don't have to use the right word, but what is the random assignment actually doing for our study or our experiment? Why is that important?
It allows for the opportunity of everyone to be selected. You might not be selected, but you at least can participate in the selection process.
Very true. But why is that important for coming to causal conclusions? Why is it important that everybody has an equal chance to get into the sample for our ability to make a causal conclusion? What is it about the randomness that makes that? What does the randomness do?
You can make a generalization about the larger size, the larger population from that small sample because of that randomization.
Okay. So that, Tyler, you got it. Representativeness. We're representing, right? The representativeness of the sample of the population. And what that's also doing is washing out any third potential causes. So if you're doing true random assignment, theoretically, like let's use, trying to think of a good example off the cuff.
Ben, I got one for you.
Yeah, go ahead.
A very real one, right? Let's say we were trying to test the efficacy of a CrossFit training program on your ability to jump high, right? But let's pretend we couldn't actually measure how tall somebody is. So at the end of the day, we could only test how high you can touch on the wall, right? If I randomly assign someone to the control group, they don't do the CrossFit, and the group that does do the CrossFit, there's an equal chance and a likelihood, if we have enough power, that height is going to be random among groups, meaning the height of the test group and the height of the other group are not going to be very different. There's going to be some tall people in group A, some tall people in group B. Not some short people in group A, some short B in group B. We've made sure that the characteristic we can't control, height, is randomly assigned so that it doesn't impact the test that we're doing. And because we can't always test, or we can't control every single variable, like personality characteristics or socioeconomic status or things like that, when we can randomly distribute it, we know statistically it's likely not going to affect the two groups. Does that example make sense with height and jumping? I'm seeing some nods.
Yeah, that's a great example. And so let's move on. So any other examples that anybody wants to share about the first one, the random assignment, random selection? Okay, let's move on to the next one. Can we ever conduct a true controlled experiment in an organizational setting? I'm very interested in your perspectives on this. And why or why not?
We said no. Because the workplace is somewhat already a controlled space, and we believe that everyone within the organization probably already has a bias that exists. There's lots of information that we may not know about the environment or the people, and that with human beings, there are many different personalities involved, which sometimes can be hard to control in an organizational setting.
Okay, good take. Any other thoughts?
I want to kind of combat that. So for our group, we said no to, but then I came up with the point that on a small scale, you can have a controlled environment. It just really depends on how much impact and how many teams are involved instead of said process. If you have something that's happening within, like, let's say, talent acquisition, depending on that team's ability and the scope of the project and how much impact to the external and internal population, you can have a controlled environment.
And here's a tough question, because really you should be asking me this question, I think, but I'm gonna ask you, not just you, Tyler, but the group. What do you think we mean by a controlled experiment? What does that mean to you? What does controlled mean?
To me, it means observate, like keeping it under close monitoring or observation.
Okay, so we're monitoring, we're measuring. No confounding variables. Becca got it. Perfect. Becca, nicely done. That is what we mean by controlled, where we're ruling out any other possible causes. Going back to the gym example Chris mentioned, we can rule out height because we've done random assignment, and perhaps we go back after and we measure that, hey, let's measure the average or the median height of the two groups A and B. And sure enough, we find out that, yeah, there's no meaningful difference between those. And so we can rule out height being a cause of people jumping higher. And then we can be more confident that it was the CrossFit training intervention that helped them, the one group, jump higher than the other. And so that's exactly what we mean. When we talk about a controlled environment, what we mean is we are able to control for all other variables. And that's kind of the point of this, is that it in an organizational setting. And I think generally you're right, Chelsea and Tyler, that there might be some examples out there where we could create a truly controlled environment in an actual live organization. I've never seen one in my career. I've never run into one. I've never conceptualized one. It's theoretically possible, I suppose, but it's not likely. You're not likely going to get agreement from an organizational leader to, hey, we're going to shut down all these other things because we need to know if this intervention predicts future performance. No, you can't do that. We still have to sell stuff.
Can I give you one on a small scale?
I have seen one, and only one.
Okay.
And it is, to Ben's point, it's exceedingly rare. It was a test of onboarding behavior. So the employee starts, and the employee has some things that they have to finish in the first 90 days of their employment. And the study was about whether or not a system-generated behavioral nudge to the manager affected whether, or the likelihood that the employee would complete this. So within a particular part of the organization that we drew a circle around, we randomly assigned these managers to either get or not get the behavioral nudge, right? And then we were able to observe whether or not the employees of these managers were statistically more likely to complete their onboarding behavior. Now, importantly, there was no performance linked to this. There was no disciplinary action. So if you were going to judge a manager or judge an employee by whether or not they finished this onboarding training, it wouldn't be ethical to do what we did. But that wasn't the case, right? It was simply to observe the efficacy of the behavioral nudge, the system-generated nudge. And so that is in my 20 years, 15 years doing this, the only time I've ever seen a true randomized experiment. So exceedingly rare, partly because it's infeasible, to Ben's point, to control everything, but also because it's usually not ethical. It's not ethical to say, I'm going to give Tyler's group something that's going to make him sell more, and Julie's group is not going to get that thing, right? That's not a very ethical or fair thing to do. Or, hey, I'm going to pay Marina more than Chelsea and see if that makes Marina work harder for the same job, right? You start to run into a lot of practical issues with true random assignment of interventions when you're talking about things like pay and promotions and ratings and that kind of stuff.
Right. Great ad, Chris. And Mallory, I saw you had your hand up, and I think Tyler, you were chiming in. So go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say we were talking in our group about like Chelsea had we talked about like if we give the employees like a pay raise if they complete like that's not ethical to do in a
Mhm.
controlled experiment, correct?
Right on.
Okay.
Right on. Yeah. And that might be a legitimate question, right? We ran into that in some of the vignettes and the examples, like, hey, we're not paying people well enough. What do we do? Well, you could construct an experiment to start paying some people more and see what happens. But we can't do that it's very unlikely you're going to be able to do that in an actual organization. Pat in someone's pocket for an experiment, not going to fly. Tyler, I didn't want to cut you off. I think you were jumping in. Anything you want to add there?
I'll be fastest because I want to move to the next topic. Essentially, the example I had was within talent acquisition. I was able to run an experiment of seeing which job posting would get more applicants based off of the words that we use. And by having aerospace in assembler, I was able to get more better applicants than having just manufacturing tech, which is our traditional standard, which is just to post a job with the normal title.
Oh, interesting. Okay, yeah. So that's an example where you might actually be able to, if you're going out to the same forums, you're sending those out, and you're literally just doing an A/B test, or you might actually be, yeah, that's a good example. Yeah, that's a good one. Okay. Well, I know we have about 30 minutes left. I want to get to some of these vignettes. We won't get through all of them, but I think this is going to be a good exercise as we move into the second vignette exercise. And also, this is going to start to transition us into really digging into business problems and the way that people normally speak in an organization, right? Just like you're seeing in these vignettes. So the first thing I'd like to introduce, and Chris, chime in at any point here, because I know you address this a lot in the book, but is an operational definition. And breaking down what an operational definition is and what is its place, what's its purpose within the scientific method and organizational research methods. And as you read, I won't read these verbatim to you, but essentially what an operational definition is a definition that helps you specifically define what needs to be measured and how it's measured, and then be able to communicate that to other people in the organization. And also, very importantly, that operational definition can port over, theoretically, you could take that operational definition, and I'm going to give you an example in a minute of employee engagement. What's that operational definition, right? Because we have lots of different definitions of what that could be. But the operational definition really gets down to how do you plan to measure that thing? And then you could take that definition and you could send it to your friend who works at a different company, and they could see the definition, say, I know what you're doing. I know how you're measuring this, and you're measuring it the same as they are. And then you go talk to your partner and you use in your own organization who might not be an IO psychologist. Maybe there's an HR business partner. Maybe they're a talent acquisition specialist. Maybe they're a recruiter. Maybe they're in operations. Maybe they're in sales, whatever it might be. And you can provide them that operational definition and they can run with it. They can run with it. They can measure it the same way that you're measuring it. So it's a really important concept as we start to break down business problems and start to get to the point where we're forming an actual hypothesis and we're going out and running a study of having a very clear definition of what it is you're measuring and how you're measuring it. So basically, it's really how you define and measure. And I'll give you some really simple examples that we could bat around. Let's start with employee turnover. And I'm going to turn this over to you all. When we say turnover, employee turnover, how might you create a specific definition of turnover? What does turnover mean?
Employees that leave the
Okay.
organization.
So employees leave the organization. But if you were going to measure that, what else would you need to know? Right. So that's clear enough, right? Turnover means employees leaving the organization. When?
I would look at how much we pay them. I would look at competitive pay.
Let focus on
Am I
the
off?
turnover itself, defining the turnover
Oh.
itself as opposed to what's causing it. I see where you're going though, Chelsea. We'll get to that. That's kind of taken a little further, but the turnover itself.
The total number of employees.
Okay, so you need to know how many total employees you have for a turnover rate,
Uh-huh.
and then what else?
New hires, hiring.
Okay,
Yeah, let's look at that. To
How long
compare.
they're staying?
say that again, Becca.
How long they're staying? Like
Okay,
the
so tenure. Let that's more of a factor of predicting it, but the turnover itself. What about? And I'll throw a couple of examples out here. What about when the turnover happens? When do you calculate it? Do you do annualized turnover? So for a year, here's the turnover rate, for example. And then to your point, Julie, you have to know your total head count for that definition of turnover. What about voluntary versus involuntary? Are you going to distinguish between people who left on their own terms versus people who got fired or laid off? Are you going to distinguish those in your definition of turnover? Chris, I saw you come off mute if you want to jump in.
Oh, we probably don't have time for me to say everything I feel about turnover. But first of all, to Dr. Ben's point, the first thing you have to decide is, are we talking about a count or are we talking about a rate, right? Because sometimes we'll say turnover and they mean how many people quit. And sometimes they'll say turnover and they mean a percentage. How many people quit over as a fraction, the amount of people that are here. And also to Dr. Ben's point, you have to define a time window. Are we talking about turnover in a day, a week, a month, a quarter, a year? Are we then extrapolating that out? Do we take a quarterly amount and then multiply it by 4 to create an annualized number, right? Then you get further complicated when you go down into the denominator, the amount of people. When are you choosing what that denominator is? End of fiscal month head count, beginning of fiscal month head count, the average of those two numbers, some random date when somebody pulled a roster. So something as deceptive as how many people leave the company that makes sense phenomenologically, logically to anybody you say it to, when you actually try to get down to, well, how did we actually calculate the number? It gets very sticky very quickly, even for something as clear cut as yesterday they worked for us, today they don't. Pretty simple, right? And yet we've poked a dozen holes in 5 minutes on how you would calculate and why you might choose to calculate. This sounds very rabbit hole, but I could go on and on about the difference philosophically of using an average monthly head count versus using an end of period head count for your denominator and why you might do that. I won't do it now, but it's doable.
This is the point of why operational definitions are so critical, is being able to very clearly articulate what you are defining and how you're measuring it. And I'm going to skip these other two because we're running out of time, but I want to give you another good example. And this is one that's near and dear to my heart: employee engagement. We define it as an attitude that's held by employees that cognitively, emotionally, and behaviorally connects them to their work and their organization. But that's not specific enough, right? If we just went around telling companies that, hey, this is all you need to do. You need to measure this. And if you get people to be more behaviorally and emotionally and cognitively attached to your company, then they're going to work harder and they're going to give more discretionary effort and they're not going to voluntarily leave. Great. What the hell do we do with that? Well, nothing. They're going to have to they're going to have to create their own measurement. So what we do instead is we create, and this is a simple form of a simplified operational definition of, it's measuring advocacy. Here's specifically what we're going to measure. It's measuring whether people feel like they're getting a sense of personal accomplishment. It's measuring whether they are giving discretionary effort. This isn't the end all be all definition of engagement. Don't take this and run with it. But this is an example and articulation of how you could take something, right? You're in a meeting, you're talking about employee engagement with 10 other people. Let's say they're all HR professionals. And you go around the room and you ask people how they define it. You're going to get 10 different definitions of engagement. And so, again, the point of an operational definition is getting it to the level of specificity where you can determine exactly how you measure it. And if I gave this, and I broke this down even in the items, if I gave this to my partner at another company, to my friend at another company, we could all define it and use it and measure it in a very similar, if not the same way. That's the point of an operational definition. And that's a big part of what we've already been doing in the vignette exercises is breaking down not just the premises, but as you get to the IV and the DV, being very, very clear about what you're measuring and how you're measuring it. So let me pause there before we kind of move on to the next part. Any thoughts, any questions on that, on operational definitions? Chris, anything you'd like to add on that piece on operational definitions?
Just for the vignette assignments, as you dig in, you're going to have to create your operational definitions about the components of your premises, right? So I happen to have a vignette exercise open right now, and one of the conclusions is the street to seat model of hiring has not produced good employees, right? When I say the word good employees, what do I mean? That's what we mean when we talk about creating operational definitions. When you get into your premises and conclusions, you have to break down the premises of the components, the premises of the conclusions, because when you want to start to test those things, you have to define specifically what the components, what the clauses in your premises are in a way that you can measure them. Sometimes they're very concrete, like turnover, where you're just arguing about parameters of data. And sometimes they're really abstract, like engagement, where we may have to, make some leaps from things like survey data into a definition of something. But at the end of the day, that's what the next evolution of this vignette concept is when we're starting to create operational definitions.
Yep. I saw
Are
somebody's
you
hand
wanting
go
us
up.
then to write our operational definition in the vignette?
I don't think we're going to get what you're going to get close to that whenever you start to define. This is going to be in the next week's assignment where you start to define the IV and the DV. And so your
The
operational,
the vignette too, Ben, I think does kind of get a little bit into the operational definition.
it gets closer to it, but I think it probably gets closer to it when you get to the description of the IV and DV. So yes, we're going to get closer to it this week, and then we're going to get when you start to articulate what your IV and DV is in those vignettes. That's where these operational definitions. But Chris is right. The exercise this week is going to take you a step toward that. Okay, so let's talk about another concept that's going to be really important in as we move into this is hypothesis testing. This is going to come back up in week 5 whenever we talk about inferential statistics, and maybe a little bit when we talk about descriptives and some of the examples. But essentially, when we are going through that scientific method, remember we're doing our research, we have our background theory, we're making some observation about something in the workplace, and then we're developing a hypothesis. And what you're often going to hear in hypothesis testing is you're going to have basically a null hypothesis and an alternative hypothesis. And it's pretty easy based on the wording. Null means basically, hey, nothing's going on here. The two groups are not different. The group that got the CrossFit training and the group that didn't get the CrossFit training, they're not going to jump any differently in terms of height. How far they can hide, it's going to make no difference. That would be an example of a null hypothesis. The alternative hypothesis is what we actually might think is going to happen, which is the group that we randomly assigned to the CrossFit training, they're going to jump higher than the group that didn't get the CrossFit training. That would be an example of the alternative hypothesis. And so what we're essentially doing when you're forming your hypothesis about what you expect to happen, we're calling that the alternative hypothesis. And we're testing, we're using observation, we're creating data, we're making some sort of observation. And then we're comparing those two groups to see which hypothesis wins out. Is it the alternative that we thought was the case based on our theory and based on our observation? Or is it the null that there isn't a difference that we expected? Tyler.
So are you saying, is this the same as a control?
No, this is a different concept than a control. This is essentially in the setup of your hypothesis. When you're making a hypothesis about how the IV is going to affect the DV, the control has to do with how you're making sure that there's no other possible explanation for the effect or the DV. Does that make sense?
Yes. So essentially, because we can't have a controlled environment, we're setting up that null hypothesis to show an actual, okay, this is with it, this is without it.
Sort of, yeah. Let me jump to this because I think this might help. What we're essentially doing in hypothesis testing is and I'll simplify for now. There is possible to have many hypotheses within the same test, but generally speaking, we're going to have two. One's going to be that there's a difference. There's a difference or there's a relationship, or there's an association. And then the null hypothesis is going to be that there's nothing. There's no relationship between these two variables. There's no relationship between engagement and performance. There's no relationship between engagement and turnover. There's no relationship between pay and performance. Your alternative hypothesis might be exactly the opposite, that there will be a relationship between pay and performance. There will be a relationship between engagement and productivity or performance or turnover. And you got to go a step further too and determine what the direction of that relationship is going to be, or what group is going to be bigger or larger or better. And so that's essentially what we're doing here. Is the null is basically saying, this is what, if we're wrong about our hypothesis, this is what we see. But if we're right about our hypothesis, then the alternative hypothesis wins out. And so we're basically, every time we're doing this, we're setting a hypothesis, we're essentially creating this. And then we have to have our backup, which is, let's assume that it doesn't work out. There's no relationship, there's no difference. And that's what the null is. And so as we get into the statistical tests, this is going to come back up when we do our actual hypothesis testing. We're looking at differences between two groups. We're looking at associations between two variables. Let me pause here because I know we're rapid firing a lot of concepts here. Let me pause. Questions, thoughts about operational definitions, questions, thoughts about hypothesis testing. Okay. So we are running out of.
Before you step further,
yeah.
What was step 2 again for the alternative hypothesis?
When you say step 2, sorry, I'm not following.
So you had said that there is a relationship. Next is, what is the correlation, strength, and direction? Is that the correct step?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Those were just examples of types of hypotheses we might pose. Okay. Generally, and sorry, let me make that clear. That's a good call out, Tyler. That's good feedback. So let me see if we have some examples here. Essentially what we would be saying when we're forming a hypothesis generally is we're comparing two or more groups and we want to see how they're different, or we're looking at whether two variables are associated with each other or not. That's very, very commonly the two different scenarios you're going to run into. That's not exhaustive, but for the most part, you're going to be comparing groups, which one's different, and did our intervention work? Chris gave a great example of the I think it was the onboarding nudging for the new manager. Did that nudging have an effect or not? The alternative hypothesis in that case would be that the nudging does have an effect, and that those managers become better managers and it has an impact on their employees. The null hypothesis would be that nudging had no impact. There was no difference between the behavior between those managers, and we're not going to detect that when we observe the outcome or the DV. Another example, and so that's the differences between groups example, very, very common. The other is going to be when we were talking about correlation. And here we're not really looking at the difference between two groups, but we want to know whether two variables are associated with each other. Are they correlated with each other? And a great example, engagement and performance. We know that people that are engaged are emotionally, cognitively, behaviorally attached to their work and their organization. Does that predict or correlate with performance? Our alternative hypothesis would probably be that people who are more engaged are performing better than people who are not engaged. They're performing less. So your IV in that case would be engagement. Your DV would be performance. and you want to see if there's a relationship between those two variables. And so again, that would be an example. To summarize it, most of the time we're looking at differences between groups, or we're looking at the association between two variables. Is there a relationship or not? Does that make sense with your question, Tyler? Does that help? Okay. Okay. So we are running out of time. I think we're gonna have to speed through this relatively quickly. I will give you access, but really this exercise was just to go through some of the vignettes together. But basically what we're doing in this is, in these exercises, the vignettes, as you have been doing already, is breaking the arguments down, the statements down into component statements. What did the people say? The people in your organization, they were talking about this stuff. They're usually not very specific. They're definitely not using operational definitions when they're talking about these concepts. But that's your job. Your job is to break it down. What are they saying? What are the premises of the argument? What are the conclusion that they're inferring or drawing? Then you're probably challenging assumptions in a very polite way. This is kind of what we were talking about last night, restating what they're saying. Okay, what I hear you saying is this, this, and this. And now we're starting to challenge, ask questions to get to, well, what do you mean by turnover? How are you calculating turnover? When you talk about people leaving at a high rate, who are you talking about? Are you talking about sales? So you're asking those questions to get more specific as to how are you actually going to measure these things? That's what we're getting to here. Then you're breaking it down into what they're saying, and then you're turning it at statement or whatever they're trying to get across. We're turning that into something that's testable. And that's where those operational definitions come in. That's where we start to create our hypotheses about how the independent variable is going to relate to the dependent variable, or whether we're seeing differences between groups. In other words, is that independent variable, that difference, going to make an effect or have an effect or predict a difference in the DV or the criterion? So let's go through one quick example. We'll do it super quickly, and then we'll go through the assignments. But basically, in this case, we got a turnover problem. The CHRO, quick serve restaurant, the KFC, Popeyes, those type of restaurants. This is an actual example, by the way. I can't tell you what quick serve restaurant, but this is a real life example that's happening right now in real life. So the made it clear she believes turnover is way too high. And she went further to say we cannot continue to lose talent at this rate in the current environment because our budgets are too tight. We can't afford to go hire a bunch of new people. We just don't have the money right now. We have to keep more people in. So the scenario, quick serve restaurant experiencing very high turnover among its front line. No people working in the restaurant. They are leaving at a very, very high rate. The companies notice, however, that some regions and locations, there's super high turnover, like 300%, meaning that every single year they turn over their entire headcount in that location 3 times. That's essentially what that number means. But then there's other locations, seemingly the same same type of restaurant. They're in a different geography. They have a different manager. They have a different leader, different franchise owner. And they're just seeing 40 or 50% turnover, meaning that at the end of the year, half of the team that was there in January is still there in December, and they only turned over half. That's a huge difference, right? Some of these stores are turning over basically 3 times a year, the entire population on average. In other words, and then other locations, just a handful are leaving every year. Huge difference, right? And you can imagine in those locations where they're having 300% turnover, they're spending a huge amounts of time trying to bring new people in, train them up, get them to productive, and then they roll out the door. Super costly. So in other words, the organization ran a survey of its workforce and found that there was a strong relationship between engagement and turnover. In other words, locations where employees are more engaged experience less turnover, and vice versa. When they're disengaged, they have very high turnover. So that's the scenario. And really quickly, we're not going to go into breakouts. Let's just take a couple of minutes to have you break down a couple of these scenarios, right? Just like we do in the vignettes. So in that scenario, first question is, let me put these in the chat really quickly, or actually, um, statements.
I got it, Ben. I'll put
You
it
got
in.
it? Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I wanna hop back to the scenario so people can look at it. So let's break it down a little bit. How would you think, let's quick hit it real quickly. How would you break down the argument of the CHRO?
There is very high turnover among frontline employees in many locations.
Okay. Now, what questions would you ask the CHRO for clarification? We talked about a few earlier as a hint.
What do you define?
What do you mean by turnover?
What do you mean by turnover? How are we defining turnover? How are we calculating turnover? Yep. What else? Are there any other premises hidden in the CHRO statement here?
She talks about the current environment. So I think I would ask, what is like, how do you define current environment?
Okay. Yep. Yep.
Talent.
Okay. Explain that.
What does she define as talent that she's willing to, that she's wanting to keep? Because not everyone's going to be someone that's going to stick versus like the
Right.
voluntary termination.
Right. And it kind of goes back to one of the points that Chris was making the other day, which is not all turnover is bad. What if some of the people leaving are really bad employees? Right. So are we talking about regrettable turnover? Or are we talking about people that we really invested in and we want to stay? So how are we measuring that? That's exactly. So this is great. So then in kind of the second question, what other questions would you ask? So we talked about getting
Ben.
clear about turnover, what we mean by turnover. And then what, let's jump to this really quickly because I know I'm going super fast. I apologize. What testable argument could you make it? How would you turn the scenario? Let me just phrase it this way. How would you turn the scenario into something that you could actually collect some data and test?
Can we use the survey that the organization just ran?
Okay. Yep. Give me
How
more.
they found that there was a strong relationship between employee engagement and turnover.
Yep. Yep. Right.
And then the locations where employees are most engaged compared to where they're not most engaged.
Right. Yep.
I'd want to add in also the tenure of the employees just to see if there's a correlation in how long someone's been with the franchise and the likelihood of them to leave.
Right. Right. Because right in this situation, I think you're calling a very important point out, Tyler. In this situation, if we're comparing stores in different locations and geographies, we have a lot of potential confounding variables there, right? We have the survey that Stuart mentioned, which is really helpful, and that's going to help us make a prediction about engagement and turnover. In fact, we've already kind of established that. But Tyler's point is a really good one in that there's going to be some meaningful differences. We have different managers. Those managers may have totally different styles of management. They may have different behavior patterns. They may communicate totally different. The stores may have different franchise owners. They may have different philosophies in how they manage and select people, right? You could have different age groups and tenure groups in those locations. You could have different demographics based on where those locations are. If you're in the Midwest versus in the middle of New York, they could be totally different demographics. Those variables might have an impact. So you have a lot of potential confounds. And so collecting data on those variables, age, tenure, maybe how much they get paid in that location, what's the overall turnover rate in that region, right? So there's a lot of other factors that you would want to measure in that study so that you could determine and rule out those impacts or be able to determine that there's a spurious correlation between engagement and turnover because of some other factor that's underlying that difference. So
whenever a leader
Yeah,
is
go ahead.
saying that something is good or bad or high or low, watch out for those words, because what it means is that it is relative to something. I dropped a link in the chat about the anchoring effect. It is always relative to something. Maybe she came from a low turnover region and now she's the CHRO and she's not accustomed to the mean effect of turnover that's perfectly normal. Maybe she came from another industry where turnover in general tends to be lower. Maybe we had a good turnover last year and now it's bad, or it's back to normal and last year was better. So always watch for those qualifying words that are judgment based, like good, bad, high, low, early, late, right? And say early compared to what? High compared to what? Low compared to what? And those probing questions that Dr. Ben talked about are going to get you so far down the road about what your business partner is thinking, it's almost going to write the hypothesis for you.
Great suggestion. Okay, just a few minutes left. I want to make sure we're kind of clear on the assignments for between now and next week. So as we mentioned, the writing assignment, we'd like to give you all an extra week. We know we took a second shot at the data manipulation activity. So the writing assignment, not due this week, it will be due the following week. Remember, participate in the discussion board. Sorry, I'm going right to left. Discussion boards. I thought you all did a great job responding to the feedback yesterday. Very thoughtful questions in the discussion board. And we're going to try to do a better job of making sure that we reply and respond. And also feel free to throw questions in there, right? If you have qualifying questions and you're explaining how your ideas have evolved, but you're still not sure about something, throw it in there. And also that's the key. We want to see how you're articulating, how your thinking has evolved. We don't want to see a regurgitation of stuff that we covered in the class. That's not the point of the exercise. The point is really see how you're explaining how your thinking has evolved in those discussions, and we will be responding. Going back, we have some readings and videos this week that start to dig into statistics. So you'll get a little bit of the research methods, you'll get a little statistics. Next week, we're going to really get into sampling and start to get into the statistical part, the math heavy stuff. That's really going to kick up in week 4. And then the vignette exercise 2. So I do want to show you a little bit, explain what we're expecting from the vignette exercise 2. I think it's relatively straightforward, but essentially what you're going to do is take the 3 vignettes that you've already progressed and you're going to take it one step further. And in that spreadsheet that you all have, there's going to be a series of red cells. And actually, I'm just going to show you this really quickly for a visual aid. Okay. So essentially, so far, let's shrink this a little bit. Okay. So essentially, so far, this is not populated, but you have started to populate these first 3, filled out these blue cells. And essentially this week, what we'd like you to do is fill out the red cells. And so there's a few things. The first thing we'd like you to do is take the vignettes that you've already worked through and you've progressed through these first 2 stages, and then take it one step further. And let me just increase this a bit so you can see. And now we'd like you to take a stab at turning that into a testable way, restate it in a way that you potentially could then take it and actually test this or measure something. So think about operational definitions. Start thinking about hypotheses. We're not going to list out the hypotheses yet. That's coming next time, but start thinking about that, because that's going to help you with the operational definition, how you clearly define what you're getting to. And so you can see some examples. We added some examples here. And then the other piece we're going to share is unlock 2 new vignettes. And what we'd like you to do is take those 2 new vignettes and take them all the way through, from breaking them down into component statements, pulling out the potential argument, and then of course, restating it in a testable way. And as you can probably glean, what we're going to do in week 3 is continue to build out. We're going to build out to the right, where you're going to start to identify your IV and your DV and your hypothesis. And then you're going to get 2 new vignettes, which you're going to take all the way through. And then after that, we're going to introduce the 2 final project vignettes. So let me pause there. Does that make sense? Any questions about that assignment with the vignettes this week?
So we're restating in a testable way from the premise and conclusions that we came up with, not the original context or component statement.
I would consider all of them as you think about it in a
Okay.
testable way. Yeah, I'd consider it all the way through from the context of the original statement and also the work you've done already.
So like summarizing all of that and putting it into a testable statement.
Yeah, and I'm about
Yep.
halfway through grading vignettes 1, guys. And so what I'm seeing is if you're doing this and you're struggling to use your premises and conclusions to make something that sounds like a relationship between variables, like Dr. Ben is talking about, go a little backwards. Go back to the example, right? Phone a friend. Because what it might be is that your premises and your conclusions aren't necessarily solid enough to create a testable conversation or testable statement. So if you can't get to it, the first thing you want to do is maybe go back 1 cell and say, did I really get to a solid inductive or deductive argument with premises and conclusions? Because if I did, I should be able to say, well, then, people that are hired in the street to seat model are more likely to XYZ than people who don't. If I can't do that, right? So don't be afraid to go a little backwards and edit some of your blue cells.
Yep. In fact, that's a good point. As you move to the right of the exercise, if you're having trouble, there's a good chance in some of your earlier steps you need to go back and refine. And it's going to help you do that, by the way. So it's actually going to help you think through whether you've defined those and you've broken them down in a way that's going to allow you to be testable, or is that testable? So this is moving to the right is going to help you with the stuff on the left. Okay. Any questions? Any final thoughts on the exercises, the assignments this week?
There's a
Okay.
question in the chat about the data manipulation exercise. You should be able to resubmit it to the same place you submitted it the first time. So essentially there will be stacked. You'll have your old one and your new one. I'll be able to use the timestamp to differentiate which is the new one and which is the old one. So the same place you submitted it the first time. Oh, Mallory answered that. Thanks, Mallory.
Yeah.
I should have read further.
Okay. Well, thank you all. We're at time. I don't want to take any more of your time. I know it's realized it's late. So thank you all for a great class and good luck on the assignments. Just reach out via email if you need. And we will see you all next Monday.
Don't forget dinner on Thursday. I just emailed you parking passes.
Thank you.
And recordings of last night and tonight's class should be in the Canvas by tomorrow.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye,
Bye.
guys.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Have a good night. Bye-bye.